Welcome to SkyeTeam's People First with Morag Barrett.
Welcome to another episode of My Wake Up Call. This is the podcast where I get to know someone a little bit, or sometimes I know them more than a little bit, but I want to save getting to know them a lot better for the podcast because I know you listeners and you viewers like to find out not just what my guests do, but how they came to do it and why it's so important to them. And I'm pleased, and I've been looking forward to, and I've been prodding my current guest to be on, because I think the world of Morag Barrett. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She helps leaders achieve outstanding results through the power of their professional relationships. She's an in-demand keynote speaker, executive coach, leadership expert, and she's the best-selling author of 3 books: Cultivate, The Power of Winning Relationships, The Future-Proof Workplace, and her most recent book, You, Me, We, Why We All Need a Friend at Work, and How to Show Up as One. So a little of her background: she's helped more than 15,000 leaders from 20 countries on 4 continents improve the effectiveness of their leaders and teams. She's a proud mother of 3 6-foot-tall sons who can thoroughly beat her in soccer, but don't stand a chance in Scrabble. Mm-hmm. She's been featured in Entrepreneur.com, Forbes, and the American Management Association. And she spent 3 weeks at sea with a group of Estonian sailors. And she prefers gin to Scotch, despite having a Scottish name. So, Morag, it's great to finally have you on.
My pleasure, Mark. And you were right. You have been gently prodding me for a little while to have this conversation. But I was just giggling as I listened to that eclectic introduction of little nuggets about me. All true.
I know. It's interesting. One of my mentors, Warren Bennis, when people would introduce him, there would be so many nuggets. And one of the things that he would say, which I thought was just so Warren-ish charming, he'd say, you know, one of the great things about having people say nice things about you is it gives you something to live up to.
Yes. No, I that is smart words, because it's always interesting. You know, I'm doing a keynote in Miami on Friday, and, you know, you get to listen to the introduction and it'll include some of those nuggets. And it can feel both exhausting and somewhat intimidating to live up to how I'm described on stage. But what I've learned, and this is what we're going to talk about today, in terms of creating relationships, you'll have heard the accent is from the UK. So I have personified the buttoned up, stiff upper lip British approach, but sharing some of the nuggets like the 6-foot boys. You've learned that I'm obviously pretty good at Scrabble, but not so good at the physical sports. These are how we start to cultivate relationships. And so letting people see some of the hidden talents from our lives or hidden experiences is what can bring us together.
Well, I'll share something that I use. I don't think it applies to you, but I often use it because it immediately connects me to the audience and the audience to me. A lot of times when you come off and you're on stage and you're intimidating, especially if you have some rah-rah energy, which a lot of people have, a lot of the audience smiles politely and says, whatever she's about to say will work for her, but it won't work for me because I'm an introvert, because I'm shy, because I would never have the courage to be on stage. So one of the things that I say, which is totally true, totally disarming, and totally engaging, is I'll sometimes step up and say, I need to do a little psychological housekeeping. I pause and they look at me and I say, I am a role-specific extrovert. What that means, I am incredibly shy, but I have to put that aside because when I'm speaking to you, if the shyness interferes, it could take away from the confidence I have in some of the stuff I'm going to share with you, which I think will actually work. And you might think, oh, he doesn't have confidence in what he's saying. I have total confidence in what I'm saying. It's just that I'm shy. And in fact, up until recently, I would never meet with other speakers the night before the cocktail party because I'd be, staring at the chip dip. I wouldn't know what to say. And then I'd show up for my talk. I'd get it over with. I'd breathe a sigh of relief. I'd go have a couple glasses of wine or gin, and then I'd talk to anyone.
So I'm with you, Mark. So if you're at an event with me, if you're in Miami and you spot me, you may see me doing an Amy Cuddy power pose. I will do them in public, but I will also go to the restroom immediately before. And my team knows I get into that last 15 minutes before going on stage. My mind goes blank. Oh my goodness, what am I going to say? Will people enjoy it? But interesting, it is a persona because like you, I am an introverted extrovert. I know I get my energy from people and the things around me for sure. But you put me into an environment where I have to make small talk. That's why I love the new intro that has those nuggets. I am literally lost for words because I'm thinking, well, I don't follow American sports, so I know nothing about baseball and American football. What are we going to talk about? My life is boring because I've lived it and I know the story. But when you drop nuggets like, I've spent time at sea with Estonian sailors, well, now there's a story that others haven't heard that I can relate and make a connection. So I think the learning for the people watching and listening is that we all have a little bit of introvert or a little bit of extrovert, whichever proportion, and how we learn to thrive requires us just to be diligent, to look up, choose how we want to show up, and then have the courage to step up and into that role, even if it is putting on a mask and lights, camera, action, here comes keynote Morag, or instead the quiet, more reflective, here comes executive coach Morag, who's a little less chatty, but just as poke the bear and pushy.
So how is it that you came to see the power of relationships and relating? And I emphasize relating because you mentioned something about the power of having a good friend or best friend at work. And tell us your story. Were you always someone who thought relationships were really important, or how did you come to believe that?
So no, it took me a while to learn it, but going from this point and the last 10 years forward, yes, it's all about the relationships. But before then, there was two parallel stories. One is my father, who I talk about in both the books, because one of the frustrations as a teenager and as a young adult is he had been there, seen it, done it. He had traveled around the UK and worked extensively. I mean, we literally walked into a garden centre after I had moved 100 miles up the road or whatever. He came with me to get some plants for the new house and bumped into somebody he knew. And that was my dad. He just seemed to know everybody. He was that 2 degrees of connection. And so whilst I had the role model, certainly early in my career, I valued independence over interdependence. I was the sort of employee who, I'm a quick study, I am highly competent, give me a challenge, a project, a task, and I will go and execute it with the minimum of fuss, the minimum of supervision, great result at the end, but through my own efforts. And it took me a while to recognize that the value of my work would eventually be recognized, but getting to high quality work with and for others was way more fun than just trying to do it on my own. And my first career was in finance, where, as you will probably not be surprised, I was told many times it's not personal, it's just business. And as I was looking at cash flow forecasts, as I was deciding whether or not to lend millions of pounds to the different companies that were approaching my bank for assistance, if it was just about the numbers, if it was just about the business, then all of my business leaders would have been rich, their companies would have been profitable, and everything would have been great. And it wasn't the case. And that, along with the role model of my dad and also the pacing of my own career, made me look at the people side, the how business gets done. Because the successful companies that I was working with as a leader and as a bank manager, etc., were the ones that didn't just have a good widget and service. They also cared as much about their relationships with their team, with their customers, with their communities, because that's what brought around the financial success and the customer loyalty to deliver the numbers in the cash flow forecast.
So let me ask you, it's one thing to see that I'll be more successful if I have better relationships than if it's just about the numbers. But there are some people I know who know that, and they're disingenuous, meaning they have all the language of interpersonal relating, but they actually don't care about relationships. They've just learned a skill. It's become quite polished, but down deep, they actually don't care about other people, but you would never know it because they learned, I better do something about the relationships. In fact, in one of my books, I shared that I would occasionally go to lunch with younger people in professional services, accounting, finance, insurance. And I remember there was one lunch in which I observed this young 30-something person asking the woman at lunch all these questions, and they were great questions. And I even took note of them, but there was something missing. And afterwards, I took him aside and I said, I assume that one day in your career, you'd like to talk to billionaires. And I don't know many of them, but I know a couple, and I talked to some of them. And my advice to you is, if you're going to ask a question to someone about something non-business, care about the answer. Because I noted that you ask really good questions, but it felt like you were just checking off a checklist that you were taught to ask. And the more discerning the other person, the more they could say, oh, they took a course. This is the how to break the ice part of the conversation. And you might want to think about that. So I'm just sharing that with you to see your thoughts, because there are people, for instance, here's another thing that I have sort of irks me a little bit. There's been a real push about storytelling. Oh, you need to be a good storyteller, have a good narrative. And yet there's a whole range between people who are just using the story as a vehicle to maneuver someone versus sharing a relevant story for the purpose of connecting with people genuinely. So any thoughts about what I just blabbed about?
No, I love it. I would concur. And in our research for You, Me, we worked with leaders through our programs, thousands of leaders who came through, and we talked about the ally mindset, i.e., how do I show up as the best version of Morag, curious about you, your story, and what you're trying to achieve. But in doing so, I don't become just a doormat or a yes person. It is understanding then the intersection. So if I start with you and what are you trying to achieve, I can communicate me, my values, what I'm trying to achieve, and then the intersection is the we. And so an ally mindset, to your point, is one that has to be curious about others. And so if you have a checklist of questions, it's a great start. But the second part of the second practice within an ally mindset is what we've described as connection and compassion. And that's where the warmth and the empathy that you're saying was missing in that particular example would come into play. And for me, when I'm thinking about the leaders that I'm working with, we'll always find toxic leaders. We're always going to find leaders who say, friends at work, this is a business, I don't have time for it. And you know what? Fine, they can be the outliers. What we can do, like you just demonstrated, is coaching that person who's recognized a right way to behave or a better way to elevate their leadership impact and reputation, but hasn't yet quite finessed it. So that's where coaching and feedback can come in, because I applaud them for demonstrating what I would call courage and vulnerability to even try it. For me, to practice making small talk, to learn the server's name, to make, and in my case, when people share upcoming life events, my way of managing all of that data is literally to put a note on my calendar for anniversaries, whether it's births, deaths, marriages. It allows me then to send a message in a year from now that says, hey, Mark, I was thinking of you. How has it been since? And all you know is, wow, Morag thought of me, and it's a deposit in the relationship bank account. The downside it becomes if it becomes Machiavellian and I'm doing it either to keep score or, as you say, to manipulate you into something. But if we're starting with abundance and generosity, if this is around success isn't a scarce resource, success is a shared resource, then for me, it's a win-win.
Unpack a little bit the word vulnerability, because there is a lot of pushback, and even emotionally available people, there's pushback because being vulnerable feels too vulnerable. But say a little bit more about that.
Oh, well, my idol in this topic is Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown, and all of her research. And she shows quite clearly you can't have courage without vulnerability. And if you think of anybody in the armed services, it takes courage and bravery to go out and fight for whatever we're fighting for, but vulnerability because it's up to and including death. Now, for most of us in corporate America or corporate wherever we're working, I'm hoping it's not literally a life or death situation. But I know from my own experience, I would keep the home morag very separate from the professional morag. I thought it was important that I presented an image as an executive coach, as a leadership facilitator, as somebody who had got her stuff in order and knew the answers. But vulnerability actually is saying, you know what, I don't know. Or how might you approach it? Or I'm sorry. Or I need help with. And that's why, again, that introduction that you use, where I've now broken the fourth wall, is it? Whatever they say on TV, where you now know I've got 3 6-foot sons. You now know I'm a mother. You know I've got family. You know I've got hobbies because you've learned about sailing, you've learned about Scrabble. What you hadn't heard yet was ballroom dancing and classical musician. But what I found is that when we have the vulnerability to share these nuggets in a professional setting, it allows for a me too set of connections, whether it's the graduating from the same university, following the same sports team, as I think of Eric Spencer on my team, who wears baseball hats, different ones, because he's found American football jerseys don't elicit this response, but wear a baseball hat and complete strangers will talk to him both about the team he's wearing or the team that they're supporting, and now he's made a connection. So you have to find what works for you. But I've learned when you let the professional wall down and start to choose how to show the full human self, the relationships become deeper and lighter at the same time.
So can you share a moment of vulnerability that you can share with us?
And yeah, many. Because the thing about vulnerability often is, for me, it's a hindsight is 2020 and a bit of a cruel perspective because you wish you'd had the vulnerability sooner. When I didn't have vulnerability, for example, would have been when I was first planning to move to the States. I was working for the European division of an American company, and I didn't talk to my bosses at the time about the fact I'd been asked to move to the US, because in my head, I'd got this inbuilt misaligned story that said they'd think I was being disloyal because I wanted to leave the division and go to the corporate headquarters. And with hindsight, I think that actually damaged a couple of the relationships I had with the executives there, because they will have misperceived it as lacking in trust in them, whereas actually lacking in trust in myself, because what if I didn't actually get to move? So there was one where I wish I'd been courageous sooner. And then another one, which was recent, it was within the last 5 or 6 years, with a mutual friend of ours, Linda Sharkey, and my fiance now, as he is now, but it was work driven. I was in a toxic business relationship, and it was literally crippling me. But what I had done is got back onto my hamster wheel of, if I just work harder, if I just keep running, I am going to be able to solve for this. Notwithstanding that Eric and Ruby on my team were also having challenges with this particular business relationship too. And when I was up, they were down. And when they were up, I was down. But I remember a particularly emotional conversation where I was sobbing and finally admitting that this was an unhealthy, unproductive place, and how do I get out? But at the same time, panicking around But that means what if we lose, walk away? How do I support Eric and Ruby? I'll be letting them down. How will our clients judge us? And all of this self-imposed stuff that actually I just remember Jeff and Linda letting me sit with. And of course, for me, the guilt of crying in public. But it was very cathartic. And without them and their, we've got your back, the sky is not going to fall in, one day at a time, Eric, Ruby and I were able to unpick that relationship. And like a phoenix from the ashes, SkyeTeam has rebounded even stronger than before. So there's two.
Mm-hmm. Can you share some examples of, in your executive coaching, how you're coaching people about vulnerability or enabling them to demonstrate it or pulling it forth from them?
So I'm working with a senior leader right now, and this is one of the very things. The shorthand context for why we're working together, definitely on the succession plan for C-suite, highly technical competence, but had allowed the team relationships, his direct reports and with his peers, to become fractured. Why? Because he had the vision to see where his division and the company as a whole could go in 5-10 years' time. But instead of bringing others with him, he was getting frustrated in their lack of ability to either buy into the vision or affect changes in processes, systems, and products to realize it sooner. So as a result, his overplayed strengths were coming to play. So self-confidence was bordering into arrogance. He was a misunderstood genius being described on his good days as a brilliant jerk, and on his worst days, just a jerk. And so helping him to understand that he didn't have to change who he was, but he did need to look up and pay attention to how others felt in his presence. I mean, you touched on others feeling intimidated maybe in our presence, but if they are scared, if they are intimidated, if they're feeling shut down, then everybody loses. And so our coaching was around how could he show up? How could he create a compelling vision, but in a way that didn't sound like he was barking orders? How could he remain curious a little longer to help answer people's confusion or questions without becoming frustrated? And that was the power of that coaching, which simple tactics, like before you go into a meeting, what are you expecting this to be on the tension scale of 1 to 10? And what was it in actuality? Because often we overplay it in our heads. His tactics around being the third person to speak versus the first person to speak. Asking more questions versus using statements. So 3 simple tactics there that any of us can adopt in any relationship, but only if we are present and in the moment and being thoughtful and deliberate around how do I need to show up in this moment for this person, for this team, for this business goal and objective.
So let me ask you something. This is something that I ask people like yourself who are incredibly admirable as you are, but they can be intimidating without intending to be, because it really sounds like you have it all figured out. Where could you get even better at yourself? Because we're all works in progress. Where are you?
So you'll be pleased to know the final chapter of You, Me, we actually come clean on that very point. Because you're right, I've written 2 books on this topic. And there are 2 things that I make clear in the keynotes and in my writing. One of which is, I am human, we are human. This is not about perfection, but it is allowing the grace and space to mess up, but don't repeat the messing up. And that grace and space can be twofold. It is when I'm lying there at 1 a.m. beating myself up with imposter syndrome or should-haves, could-haves, would-haves, let it go, and choosing how am I going to show up tomorrow. and applying that same grace and space for our colleagues. And we've all seen the meme, because if we aren't paying attention to their story, if we're just assuming that they are the job title and the pair of hands that we see at work, but we aren't curious about what's happening in their whole life, we can write negative stories when they are distracted by a sick relative or childcare needs, or I'm moving house and the landlord won't renew the rent or whatever. If we're not curious, how do we give them the space they need to navigate their whole lives so that they can still be their best in their work lives as well? And so, in answer to your question, I admit I'm not perfect. Courage and vulnerability, I can do it till the cows come home. When it's a business risk, when it's a morag risk, I'm a pussycat and a pushover. Candor and debate, I love arguing around, should we use this 360 tool? Do we like the font and color on this PowerPoint slide? But when it comes to giving tough feedback, I will angst over it for days. So again, these are why I call them practices, because we are forever, perpetually practicing and getting better. And occasionally we'll fluff, we'll miss the landing, at which point learn, adjust, and move on.
Can you share an example of something? Because I'm also taking this in for myself, because there will be times when I will be beating up on myself about something, and I know intellectually, it's already, to quote our friend Marshall Goldsmith, it's already happened. That you that it happened to or with or by is no longer you. I mean, you're focusing on a you that no longer exists. And by the way, the future you doesn't exist either. So just let it go. And it seems so simple, but it's not easy. What do you think? What do you think stops you from letting things go? And I'm just thinking about myself, various things that stop me from letting things go. From Mark, you could have done a better job. That that was gratuitous. That was uncalled for. What allows you to let go of things when certain things are niggling at you?
Time certainly helps. Talking it through with Eric and Ruby, or with other close allies, because they'll often bring a perspective that at least turns the volume down on the, oh my goodness, I'm a useless person, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm a failure, whatever it might be that I'm telling myself, from being a klaxon loud 10 to maybe a 4.5. Now it's just annoying background noise. So that is one thing, is talking it through with another. But I also like the idea of rituals and symbols. So here I am screwing up the Post-it note. So the writing it down, I forgive myself, or I shouldn't, well, okay, screw it up, throw it away. And if it's towards, or I feel like it's had an impact on somebody else, this is the courage and vulnerability piece. And it's something that I'm starting to lean into, is pick up the phone and make an apology. But the challenge can be, if I do that, but I want you to say, oh, Morag, no, you're fine, or I'm sorry too, then that isn't a true apology. It is, hey, Mark, this has been preying on my mind. I recognize that when I did X, it had the impact of Y. You may or may not notice, but I just wanted to let you know it has been sitting with me. I'm sorry. And that's it. Let it go at that point. Now, if they choose to continue the conversation and go deeper, then great. But if they just say, no, or yes, Morag, you were being a brilliant jerk, stop it. All you can do is take the Marshall advice of say thank you and then move on.
Something that I use, and maybe you'll find it helpful. I've had 8 mentors. They've all died. And the last one was Larry King, and before him was Warren Bennis. So I had some pretty, interesting.
Wow.
I wish self-statements worked for me. When I see people being able to say a positive affirmation to themselves or forgive themselves, I wish I could do that, but I've never been able to. So one of the things that I've constructed, and I recommend to other people who have similar difficulties, is what I call the Dead Mentor Society. So after a podcast in which I think I've been tangential, in which I think I haven't been as focused as I should have been or as professional, I'll call up Larry King, and he's only died in the last year or so. And I'll say, Larry, wake up. And in his Brooklyn accent, I'll say, what, Mark? I'll say, Larry, I did it again. What? Oh, I was on this podcast and I got off on a tangent. I started a story. I got lost in the story, and then I said, there's 5 things you should remember about something. And I only named 3. And he says, Mark, what did the host think? Oh, she loved it. She said, you can come back anytime. And he says, Mark, you woke me up for this? I'm not even cold yet. Go to one of your older mentors who's been dead longer than me. I'm trying to rest in peace. Will you give it a break already? And then what happens is I cross over to just remembering meeting him for breakfast almost every day for a couple of years before COVID with a little group. And then I just remember missing him, and feeling lucky that he was in my life. And when I can think of that, missing him, being grateful, suddenly I don't beat up on myself anymore.
I love that. It's the what would Larry say technique.
Exactly.
And again, it comes back to there isn't a one size fits all for this. There isn't a one size or one definition of what does it mean to be an ally. There is the SkyeTeam and Eric, Ruby and I in this. But it's like if you Google the word leadership, you literally get billions of results. And if you even go do great leadership or freaking awesome leadership, it's still 1 million plus. So for all of these things, the most important definition that anyone listening to this can be is their own, whether it's informed by their mentors like Warren Bennis or whomever, or it comes from within. Because if you can't articulate what it means to be a good human, a good mother, a good leadership coach, how can you at the end of the day reflect on, as Marshall would say, did I do my best? So how did others feel in my presence? That's the lookup. That's the definition of how do I want people to feel? Then choosing intentionality around how do I show up? Which of my leadership traits do I need to turn the dial up on? And which do I need to turn down on? And then did I step up? Did I do my best? And if everybody can do that and create their own coping mechanisms, whether it's what would Larry say, or the screwing up of the note and throwing it away for the physical symbolization of letting that go for it. Because what works for you is it's going to elevate your leadership impact and reputation no matter what. Do it.
I love that. So you've more than succeeded in whetting the appetite of my listeners to find out more about you and your partners and your new book. Can you leave us with one of these sort of a hidden in plain sight nugget from your research that people would say, I never would have thought of relationships like that or the power of them, but wow, that's exactly true. So can you share something to hook them in even further?
Well, let's start with the power, and then I'll go with the hidden in plain sight. So the power of relationships, thinking back to our lives and careers, I would put money on there is no high and there is no low that any of us have experienced in isolation. All of them have come through our interactions with and through others. So relationships are inherent. Even if you're a solopreneur, they're inherent in everything that we do. Then the hidden in plain sight really goes to the title for You, Me, We, why we all need a friend at work and how to show up as one. Because for nearly 20 years, Gallup have been doing research on engagement. And of the 12 questions that if we answer agree or strongly agree, it implies we have an engaged workforce and they can show the correlation to bottom line, productivity, satisfaction, intent to stay, and all of that. Question 10 is, do I have a best friend at work? And for me, the hidden in plain sight is that is the wrong question. Because do I have a best friend at work is passive, it is reactive. It allows me to fill in that questionnaire and say, well, no, because Mark got the promotion I should have done. No, because Mark got the A talent from my team or the money for the project I wanted to work on. The hidden in plain sight is if you want to have a friend at work, you need to be a friend at work. The question we should all be asking ourselves is, am I a friend at work? And then closing that gap. Because if we all did that, if we all had the courage and vulnerability to step into being the true, authentic leaders we can be and in service of others, there would be no stopping us. And I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I've seen it impact my client organizations, teams, and leaders. That is where we need to be focusing.
I love that. You just triggered something. I don't know if you can use this, but you just triggered it. And if you say, "Ooh, I like that." If you say to someone, do you see love as something you receive, or do you see love as a verb, something you give?
Mm-hmm.
And it's along those lines. Are you someone, if you want love, you need to learn how to be loving?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I'll end with something that also to reinforce, because I had on the podcast Robert Waldinger. Robert Waldinger took over the study at Harvard, the longest lasting study, 75 years. It was handed to him by George Vaillant. And Robert Waldinger did a TEDx talk at Boston TEDx, and it has had 43 million views.
Okay.
It's on the TED homepage. And what he talked about is what makes for a good life. What did the 75 years show? And they expected a good life, health, exercise, and whatever. And what they discovered is what makes for a good life is healthy, long-lasting, supportive relationships. More than anything else. And a relationship that's critical doesn't make for a good life. So healthy, loving, long-lasting relationships. But it's a wonderful TEDx talk, but it totally reinforces what you're saying. So I would encourage you, your partners, and anybody listening in to grab a look at Robert Waldinger's TEDx talk. And thank you for being on. Where's the best place for people to find you?
Well, you can check us out at youmeWeBook.com, and my corporate page is SkyeTeam, SKYE, team.com. And I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So please connect with me. I will be the one who's responding to your messages, but I am here as your ally. If there are questions, resources, tools that I can provide that help accelerate you and your leadership impact and reputation, then just ask. And let's start a beautiful friendship.
Well, and I'm so glad that that's exactly what we have. Something that I'm going to take away from and is the word ally. I think it's a lovely word because it implies connection, friendship, having each other's back.
Mm-hmm.
Also, your best allies are also very candid with you. They tell you what you need to hear, or maybe not what you want to hear, but it's laced with love.
Yes.
And their belief in you. So thank you, my dear friend. And thank you to our listeners for supporting the podcast. And please share this with other people. I think this particular episode will benefit many people because as a listener, it's you, me, and we are all involved together. So everyone take good care. And when wake-up calls come your way, don't beat up on yourself. Just wake up and connect with someone. Take care.
Thank you so much for joining Morag today. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe so you don't miss a thing. If you learned something worth sharing, share it. Cultivate your relationships today when you don't need anything before you need something. Be sure to follow SkyeTeam and Morag on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any ideas about topics we should tackle, interviews we should do, or if you yourself would like to be on the show, drop us a line at info@skyeteam.com. That's SKYE team.com. Thanks again for joining us today, and remember, business is personal and relationships matter. We are your allies.